My name is Miguel Garcia. In this video, I will introduce a general discussion about social groups. We all know about social groups, don't we? But what are they? Do they actually exist? And if they exist, how can we account for their existence? In contemporary social ontology, these are some of the most pressing questions awaiting an answer. So let's have a look. Social groups are just the kind of entities that we are very familiar with. We all belong to one social group or another. So, in this sense, we can say that social groups are essential for understanding sociality or our social world. But more specifically, we can ask, what to think of social groups? Charles Stanward, in his book on social groups in action and interaction, he says that social groups are the foundation of human existence. Groups provide us with friendship and emotional support. They help us make decisions and they help us get work done. Similarly, in his book Social Ontology, Raymond Tuomela says, humans are social beings and adapted to living in groups, indeed, to functioning in several different groups during their lives. Anthropologists have provided evidence that for at least 2 million years, the Homo family has lived in groups and has become genetically adapted to group living, plainly to survive and be able to reproduce and raise offspring. Indeed, it seems warranted to say it on evolutionary and psychological grounds that group sociality is an inherent aspect of humanness and hence that is intrinsically valuable for humans to belong to groups. However, there are still some philosophical questions about social groups. In the SCP entry on social ontology, Brian Epstein asks, do social groups exist at all? If so, what sorts of entities are they? And how are they created? Is a social group distinct from the collection of people who are its members? And if so, how is it different? What sorts of properties do social groups have? Can they have beliefs or intentions? Can they perform actions? And if so, what does it take for a group to believe, intend, or act? These are serious questions that social ontologists are very much concerned with answering. But before looking at specific answers, let me clarify what we mean by social groups. In general, social ontologists understand by social groups those groups composed at least in part by people. For example, couples, friends, clubs, like a chess club, music bands, like Iron Maiden, corporations, like Google, McDonald's, Starbucks, international organizations, like NATO, and so on. Now, some other people would say that also for something to be a social group, it must be an agent. There is another video in this series which is concerned specifically with group agency and collective intentionality. So I leave to them a specific discussion on this topic. For now, let's discuss some general metaphysical views about social groups. According to Frederick Schmidt's Introduction to the Socializing Metaphysic, he says that there are two general metaphysical views. First of all, ontological individualism, which says that social groups are anything other than individuals, their non-social properties and admissible composites thereof. Of course, now we need to explain what non-social properties are and what counts as an admissible composite. In general, non-social properties include mental, physical, biological properties. And admissible composites are sets, fusions, mereological sums. Now, for Schmidt, there are two versions of ontological individualism, reductionism and eliminativism. Reductionism holds that there are social groups, though they are identical to their individual members. A very good example of this would be Watkins and his principle of methodological individualism, which says that all social phenomena are reducible to individual phenomena. Eliminativism, on the other hand, says that there are no social groups at all. Reference to groups, that is merely a feature of the grammatical structure of language, more like a heuristic device. Anthony Quinton would be a very good example of this. He says that all statements of social facts are statements of individual facts. The opposite of ontological individualism is ontological holism, which says that social groups exist over and above individuals, their non-social properties and admissible composites thereof. The clearest example here would be Durkheim, who says that social facts are things that exist in our world and that are irreducible to psychological facts. Now, these different views have certain problems. There are certain questions that they need to answer. For reductionism, the question is how to account for the unity of social groups. That is, the fact that group members are themselves bound into a single entity. For eliminativism, the question is our talk of social groups and a fortiori our social theories based on error, similar to our moral theories under the assumption that no moral claim is literally true? And for ontological holism, the question is what kind of sui generis or spooky entities are social groups that we cannot analyze them any further? So these are important questions, but instead of focusing on these general views, let me consider very briefly some particular views of social groups. I discuss Margaret Gilbert's plural subject theory, Paul Sheehy's ontological holism, Nick Effingham's revised set theory, Catherine Ritchie's structuralist account, Catherine Hawley's social mereology, and Amy Thomasson's normative approach. Let me start with Margaret Gilbert. According to her plural subject theory, a social group consists of individuals who are willing to share in an action or attitude as a body, but the willingness itself and its manifestation are necessary for a group. So there are two steps involved here. Firstly, individuals express their willingness, and secondly, individuals constitute with first a joint commitment. Now there are lots of things to say about joint commitment. Let me just mention two. First, a joint commitment is different from a shared goal. We can all have the same goal, but we may not know that we all have the same goal. And secondly, a joint commitment implies some participatory obligations and rights. Now, let me focus simply now on the role of joint commitment for the existence of social groups. According to Gilbert, there being a joint commitment, for example, to go for a walk together, it only takes for a social group to exist as a plural subject. Now, we need to be careful with the formulation of this principle. If a joint commitment is a necessary and sufficient condition for the existence of a social group, then we may think there are many more groups than we expect. For example, when my wife and I decide to go for a walk together, then we create a group. And when we decide to go for dinner, then we create another group. And when we decide to play football or to play basketball together, then we create another group. So by understanding joint commitment as all it takes for a social group to exist, then we may end up with many more entities in our world than we were prepared to accept. So there are certain specific challenges to Margaret Gilbert. First, for example, Sheehy has said that there is a problem of circularity. Joint commitment, he says, entails the existence of the group that is meant to be created based on such joint commitment. That is, for an individual to form and express the required readiness or willingness, she must have a real conception of the group to which she's going to join in action. So the group must exist, at least as the object of indirect reference, for there to be a joint commitment. Another objection comes from Thomasson. She says that Margaret Gilbert's account is too narrow. If we consider only those groups which are created based on joint commitments, then we exclude from the classification all those other groups that don't require for their existence any form of collective intentionality. For example, racial and gender groups, families, nations, etc. Let me consider now Sheehy's ontological holism. According to Sheehy, social groups are material particulars, which alongside individual persons and artifacts count as objects in the social world, figuring in our explanations and descriptions. Groups, he says, are ontologically on a par with individuals in the social world. Moreover, he says, our best understanding of groups is as composite material particulars formed through interrelated individuals. This is basically what constitutes his interrelational account of social groups. Now, in a paper published prior to the book, he explains more carefully what he means by this composite nature of groups. He says, they have potentially changing parts interrelated to form a unitary whole, individuated in virtue of their causal and explanatory role. Now, in explaining this explanatory role, he seems to be assuming Aquinian scientific realism, according to which explanatory role of groups offers prima facie support for the possibility of ontological holism. In some other parts of his book, he makes some other statements and he provides some evidence in support of this ontological holism. In particular, he discusses the causal powers of social groups. Holism, he says, regards the individual as not simply influenced by others, but by the group that is constituted by those others and herself, standing in a pattern of mutually affecting relations. The holist, he adds, wishes to argue that the predication of a property to individuals collectively is just equivalent to predicating it to a group. This assumes, though, that there are properties or causal powers which do arise from the interrelations of individuals. Again, in his paper, he says something more specific about these properties. In making moral, legal, or political judgments, he says, we attribute or deny certain capacities or roles to groups. We may also want to attribute them with a mind of their own. Sheehy, of course, is not alone in thinking of group minds. Very famously, Christian List has defended not only the existence of group minds, but also group consciousness. His theory relies on a functionalist theory of mind and an integrated information theory. But I won't discuss List's account here. Let me only mention a couple of challenges that Sheehy is meant to answer for his account to be successful. First, not everyone endorses Quinian scientific realism to determine what there is and what there isn't in the world, much less social, including moral, legal, and political sciences. Secondly, he needs to explain what he means by interrelation. That is, what kind of interrelations are meant to be in place here. Without specifying what counts as an interrelation between individuals, the account stays at best incomplete. For example, are two people standing at 2 meters from each other while waiting for a train in the relevant kind of interrelation? Well, he needs to say more. Let me consider now Effingham's revised set theory. Effingham argues against fusionism, which is the view that social groups are fusions or restricted diachronic compositions of individual people. However, he says, while fusions have parts, social groups have members, but parthood isn't the same as membership. Otherwise, for example, not only Ronaldo would be a member of the Manchester United, but also his legs, nose, lungs, kidneys, etc., since parthood is transitive. That is, if A is B is part of B and B is part of C, then A is part of C. So against fusionism, Effingham says that social groups are sets of a particular kind, namely the kind of sets that can change the members across times and possible worlds. Precisely because of this, he doesn't defend the classical setism, the classical view of setism, according to which sets have membership essentially. So if there is any change in membership, then this implies a change in the identity of the set. So for Effingham, a chess club, for example, is identical to a set, the first member of which is a possible world, W, and the second is another set, whose first member is an instant or a time, for example, T1, and the second one is the group of people, or the set containing the individual members of the group. For example, Nick, Franz, and Jill. Now, since this kind of sets can change the membership across time and possible worlds, then it is possible for the chess club to be identical to a different set at a different time. For example, in T2, the group members are Nick, Robert, and Jill. And it is also possible that in a different possible world, for example, W star, the members are John, Paul, and Ringo. So all these changes are identity preserving. This is one of the virtues of Effingham's revised set theory. However, there are still some problems with his account. He also considers all these challenges, but his answers may not be completely decisive. Let's think about the abundance problem. There are many more groups than we usually think of. For example, where Nick, Franz, and Jill exist, the set Nick, Franz, and Jill also exist, but they are not a group. Or think, for example, of you and I. You and I exist, and so according to Effingham, there is a group whose members are you and I. But we are clearly not a group. So what there being individuals entails there being sets thereof. Those sets don't entail there being groups of such individuals. Another problem is that setism doesn't explain group properties. Since the membership relation according to setism remains constant across times and possible worlds, it doesn't have the resources to explain the varying properties of groups. For example, its size, the normative capacities it has, whether it is profitable or not, etc. So some of the most important things that we want to know about groups are not explained by setism. Finally, there is the problem of abstract nature. Whether sets are located in space-time is a mystery. This is something that Effingham himself recognizes. So setism doesn't guarantee that social groups have concrete nature and so causal power. Let's move now to Ritchie's structuralist account. which is a very popular view of social groups. According to Ritchie, social groups are realizations or instantiations of group structures. Thus, they are concrete. They exist only when the structure is instantiated. Her purpose is to explain both groups as one unitary entity, in particular as instantiations of social structures, and groups as many, or members of a class, more specifically as those individuals instantiating the structure. Groups, she says, have organizational structure, namely roles occupied by individuals or perhaps other groups, and relations, determining, for example, whether group members are related in a symmetric or asymmetric way, that is, in a non-hierarchical or hierarchical way. If a group G exists, then it is instantiated. So its existence and persistence doesn't depend on the existence and persistence of particular individuals. And this is why Ritchie's structuralist account is different from, for example, Effingham's revised set theory. As we have seen, for Effingham, for example, the fact that you and I exist is all it takes for a social group to exist, since this social group would be identical to a set whose members are you and I. But for Ritchie, this is totally different. There may be a group, but only if you and I instantiate a social structure. According to Ritchie, there are 6 common properties of social groups that any successful account of social groups is meant to explain. Firstly, social groups have different membership at different times. Think, for example, of a football team that can grow or shrink. Now, her account can explain this because she can say that a social structure can be instantiated by a group of people at some time, but it can be instantiated by different people at different times. So this is okay. Another property is that social groups have different members across possible worlds. For example, Iron Maiden's drummer is currently Nico McBrain, but it could have been Rick Allen. Ritchie can explain this simply by saying that a social structure can be instantiated in this possible world by some people, but it may be instantiated in another possible world by different people. So this is okay. Another property is that a group can exist at a time without existing at every time. For example, NATO was created on the 4th of April, 1949. So it didn't exist before that, and it may not exist for much longer. But Ritchie can explain this as well, because she can say that social structure can be instantiated at some time without it being instantiated at any other time. Fourth, a group can exist in this world without existing at every other world. For example, Manchester United exists in this world, but it wouldn't exist hadn't football been invented. Ritchie can also explain this by saying that a social group can have a social structure that is instantiated in this world, but not in another world. Another property is groups are located in space-time. Think, for example, of the Mexican Supreme Court, which is obviously located in Mexico. Now, Ritchie can explain this just by saying that when a social structure is instantiated, then it is a concrete object. It has also causal powers, and so it is spatial-temporally located. Finally, there can be non-identical groups with coextensive membership. For example, the chess club can have the exact same members as the philosophy department, and yet they are not the same groups. So Ritchie can explain this simply by saying that these groups, although they have the same members, they have different structures. Even when it's a very popular and clearly a very well elaborated account, Ritchie's account has received some criticism. In particular, Brian Epstein has argued against Ritchie that her criterion of identity, for example, that U1, the group 1, and the group G2 are identical if and only if they are instantiations of the same structure, allows for a group structure to change from time to time and from word to word unrestrictedly, thus rendering groups radically discontinuous. This seems to be a problem for Ritchie, since any change can be okay. Let me consider now Hawley's social mereology. According to Catherine Hawley, social groups are composite concrete particulars, having ordinary human beings among the parts. Her view is meant to answer some questions raised by Ruben in his paper, in his 1983 paper, where he says that whatever relations human beings bear to social entities, the relation of being part of is not one of them. In particular, Hawley asks why we should regard social groups as composite. And she says because they aren't simple and inherit certain properties, including causal power, from their parts. Also, why to consider social groups as concrete particulars? Well, she says, because they are embedded in the physical world and have interactions with human and non-human entities. So for her, the best way to go here is by accepting some form of mereological account of social groups. But mereological here indicates the relationship between constituent and group as one of parenthood, rather than membership in a set theoretic fashion. Her view has certain constraints, though. First, social mereology can explain group membership. But this is just fine, she says, because parenthood is transitive, as we already saw. And so it cannot rule out that, for example, not only Ronaldo is part of Man U, but also his legs, nose, lungs, kidneys, etc. The moral here is that being a member of is different from being part of. The former is determined by other facts, for example, the conditions for occupying a role, like being elected, signing a contract, submitting a form, etc. Secondly, two coextensional groups are one and the same group. For example, the chess club is the same as the philosophy department, although they play different social roles. Compare this to the individual case. One person can be a CEO of a company, a hockey player, a stepfather, a taxpayer, etc., simultaneously, without this implying that there is more than one person. So the moral here is to determine the social roles that correspond to each group, we need to look at the constitutive rules, not at the mereological composition. Moreover, by employing predicational shift, she says, we can explain what is not pragmatically correct to say that the chess club, for example, but not the philosophy department, won a chess tournament. Finally, a social group is identical to the sum of its members, so its location as a material object corresponds to the unique region occupied by them. The moral here is that material location is different from official location. For example, for taxation, voting, etc., which is also determined by constitutive rules. So, with all this, what Hawley wants to say is that although it seems that mereological account social groups have some counterintuitive cases or produce some counterintuitive consequences, in the end, we can bet the bullet, and then we can explain why it's difficult, but it's still correct to say that social groups are mereological sums. There are several problems or several challenges that Catherine Hawley's account is meant to answer. One of them is that her view is strictly or significantly limited. If social mereology is correct, then it's not part of the social ontology to explain anything interesting about social groups, other than the fact that they are composite concrete particulars. It is left to sociology, psychology, political theory, etc., to explain what makes a mereological sum of people a group. For example, they're having an intention to share in an action, they're being treated or regarded as a certain way, they're filling out a membership form, etc. In other words, social mereology excludes structures, norms, actions, attitudes, etc., from the ontological metaphysical investigation of social groups. Finally, let me consider Thomasson's normative approach. According to Thomasson, individual social group concepts function to give normative structure to our lives together. As such, she defends some kind of concept of priority. It is better to begin not by asking what a social group is, but rather by asking what function the concept of a social group does or can serve for us. Why should we want such a concept in our lives or in our theories? Like Brian Epstein's project in his book The Ant-Trap and other papers, Thomasson is not really worried about whether or not social groups exist. Clearly, there are social groups. She's also not interested in identifying what kind of entities social groups are. Her concern is in highlighting the function that social group concepts have for us in our lives. Based on her easy ontology as developed in her 2015 book, Ontology Made Easy, she says social group concepts, for example, chess club, ManU, NATO, etc. have application conditions. That is, conditions under which they will refer when an entity of the relevant kind to exist. And this is independent of whether such concepts figure in our best scientific theories. So unlike Sheehy, for example, she doesn't rely on any coinant scientific realism. She doesn't want to say if such and such social group concept appears in our base scientific theory, then we are committed to the existence of the group. Instead, she wants to say that social group concepts have an important function, and that's why they are relevant for us. Now, in explaining their function, she's focused on K-groups, that is, groups of a certain kind, and their corresponding application conditions, which can help us identify their associated norms, in virtue of which we can distinguish between organized social groups, for example, Supreme Courts, football teams, faculty committees, etc., and de facto or feature social groups, like racial, gender, and ethnic groups. In particular, she identifies three general kind of norms associated to K-groups. First, there are shared internal norms, which regulate the internal relations and behavior of group members. For example, how group members are meant to interact with each other, what they are meant to wear, etc. Secondly, there are structural norms, which establish the normative capacities, for example, powers, rights, duties of group members qua role holders. Thirdly, there are public external norms, which regulate how group members are to be treated or regarded by outsiders or non-group members. For example, positive or negative discriminatory norms. Importantly, these three kinds of norms can be either formal, as in institutional, or informal, as in conventional. Also, not all kind of groups include the three kinds of norms. For example, a book club may have shared internal norms and public external norms, but no structural norms, assuming that, for example, they all occupy totally symmetric roles. Another example is a secret society, which may have shared internal norms and structural norms, but no public external norms, since group members which not to be recognized as constituting any group. Finally, another example is a racial group, which may only have public external norms, if the grouping isn't under the member's control. For example, I am a member of the Latin group, but I don't occupy any particular role, and so I don't have structural norms applying directly to me. The normative significance of her account indicates that, for example, it is only because there exist such norms or normative relations and constraints that K-groups are important for us. Thus, mere pluralities, mereological sums, or sets which lack normative significance are not the kind of entities that we talk about and investigate when using social group names. For example, the composite entities Mary and Jane, or Mary and Jane and Jane Snows, carry no significance for us since they do not stand in any normative position. Compare this to the married couple Mary and Jane, which is associated with internal, external, and structural normative relations, and so they are important for us. The normative approach then has an important consequence. Social group concepts give normative structure to our lives together, not because they entail the existence of shared features, shared forms of cognition or behavior, interlocking tensions, structural organization, etc., but because they carry normative significance regarding, for example, how group members are to act, what capacities they have, what role holders, how they are meant to be treated or regarded, etc. Now, this approach is still compatible with judging certain internal, external, and structural norms associated to K-groups as unfair or underlying some form of social injustice. So the normative approach doesn't support the existence of particular norms. It only highlights that there are these norms, and because of these norms, then social group or social group concepts are important for us. There are three particular advantages with this view. First, there can be non-identical coinciding groups. For example, the chess club is not identical to the philosophy department, even when they have the same members, because different norms apply to each group and the group members. Secondly, it allows for including in our theorizing about groups the largely ignored phenomenon of social identification. For example, group members can take themselves to be bound by the relevant norms or to be responsive to them, and so on. Thirdly, it allows for appreciating tensions or conflicts resulting from taking different roles. Since K-groups are linked to norms, being a member of various K-groups may imply holding incompatible normative commitments. For example, belonging to a pacifist group while also belonging to a member of a military supporting political party. So in general, I would say Thomasson's normative approach answers some of the most important or most interesting questions that we are concerned with when discussing about social groups. That's it. Thanks for watching.